Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from Cantrips. I'm talking about the new album from Chris Carter, Chris Carter's Chemistry Lessons Volume 1, or CCCL Volume 1. Okay, so this was a strange request for me. When the guy who sent this in gave me this request, I'll admit I had no idea who Chris Carter was, or what was so special about the guy. But I looked him up, and as it turns out, he is a former member of the industrial group Throbbing Gristle. Throbbing Gristle were a big deal in the underground, real game changers they were. And Carter himself was the group's resident synthesizer player, among other things. I mean, they were around back in the mid-70s, predating even Cabaret Voltaire, so that's cool. Not to mention Carter formed an offshoot of Throbbing Gristle alongside other member Kosi Fanny Tootie. Sorry for butchered pronunciation, appropriately called Chris and Cozy, and later Carter Tootie, who have also been regularly putting out music for a few decades now. Now, as it may be pretty obvious, I don't actually follow Throbbing Gristle at all. Industrial music tends to be a bit of a blind spot for me when it comes to electronic music history. I've not heard anything else from Chris Carter besides this one project, so I imagine I'm gonna get plenty of people yelling at me to check out previous material, so I'm sorry I don't really have the proper context for this that a longtime fan of the group might. I got an outsider perspective as per usual, and I'm covering what appears to be like a one-off solo project, or a two-off solo project if Carter plans on releasing a second volume of Chemistry Lessons. But it does appear that my lack of experience in industrial music probably doesn't matter in the case of this particular project, because there's, like, nothing industrial about it. Chris Carter's Chemistry Lessons is a collection of 25 mostly 2-3 minute vignettes done in old-school artificial intelligence IDM style, combined with occasional elements of synth pop. A good way to describe this project is kind of like if Oker's A Midsummer Night's Dream was structured kind of like the Black Dog's music for adverts and short films. It certainly takes very strong command over its atmosphere, and given how it's coming from this guy who was making music with synthesizers in the era when electronic music world was mostly limited to names like Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Jean-Michel Jarre, and all those guys, albeit he was doing it in a very different style from them back then. I can definitely see why so many people were interested in this solo project here. I think it's the most recent project tied to Throbbing Gristle in any way. It just came out last year. Granted, if we're just going by my reaction, I admittedly struggle to find much of anything to actually say about this project. You'd think 25 tracks means a ton of interesting material to go through, but for the most part, CCCL just completely runs together for me. Not to mention, sure, it's coming from an old synth pioneer, but stylistically doesn't do anything that I haven't heard before out of so many other 90s IDM projects. If I didn't know any better, I'd think this was coming out of Bandcamp artist number 270,000 that thinks they're being creative by rehashing Aphex Twin's formulas. One that happens to be really well produced, but in terms of interesting or boundary-pushing ideas, this has next to nothing. That's not to say the project is bad by any stretch. All of these pieces are well done enough for what they're trying to do, and it'll scratch all the itches of you people who just really love the artificial intelligence sound and just want more of that kind of stuff. I just kind of found it to be pretty average, though. I suppose I can discuss some individual tracks here. Not all 25 here actually have something for me to say. Most of them just blend into the background and I can't tell most of them apart, but there were a couple moments that did stick out to me. Here's basically all the notes I have on an individual track basis. The tone is set rather effectively with the opener Blissters, with all its fluttering arpeggios and relaxed mood. It has a couple of neat vocals mixed pretty low that fit well in the mix. And Tangerines keeps my interest with the slightly stronger backbeat and some little string sounds around the edges. But the mood of the album doesn't really progress all that much beyond the tones of those first two tracks. Cernubicua has some childish-sounding vocals covered in effects that give me a bit of a Boards of Canada vibe. Pillars of Wa had a somewhat creepier intro with dissonant choirs and minimal percussion, but slips back into the previously established mood after like 30 seconds. Modularity focuses entirely on progressions of shifting C notes. Riveting. Moon 2 had a nice, subtle, and aquatic atmosphere to it that I found quite nice, even if some of the subtlety wore off in favor of some string sections later on. Durlin had a couple of dissonant progressions that sounded kind of awkward. Corvus pretty consistently grabbed my attention with its ethereal vocals that contributed to a comparatively darker feel. Dustin Spiders had a lot of light clanking noises that sounded like an old air conditioning system banging alongside major keypads. Lab Test had more energy than a lot of the preceding tracks and stuck out to me primarily thanks to its more prominent mechanical beats, but didn't really progress much beyond its initial ideas. Shieldreak felt like 3 or 4 tracks connected together at various parts. Ghosting had some glassier tones in the first couple of seconds that I thought were pretty cool, but otherwise didn't deliver that much a note. Noise Floor felt like it might have actually picked up a little hint of industrial atmosphere in the beginning and slightly carried over later by its modulated, breathy vocal samples and whirring background elements, as does Post-Industrial, obviously, with all its clanking metallic tones and semi-abrasive, almost guitar-like synths. Obviously not so abrasive to feel out of place or break the overall tranquil mood, but, you know, just by comparison. Rehndim unintelligible vocals give me a bit of like a Mouse on Mars kind of vibe. There's some cool house-ish pianos in the outro, and it also features vibraphones, which is good in any context. Time Curious Glows did have some really nice ambient soundscapes with choir-like pads. Vetus started out a bit with that more clanking atonal atmosphere, but built some warmer and more dramatic progressions around it alongside other neat background vocals. That was a nice one, even if it ended really abruptly. And I guess the closer, Inkstain, also had some more watery, blurry, completely unintelligible vocals that I guess gave the piece some humanity, but not necessarily the best possible use of vocals on this whole album. It's a good place to finish as any, I suppose. That's pretty much everything I have to say as far as individual tracks go. And I'm kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel with a bunch of those. Now, I do at least get the appeal of a project like this. For instance, just earlier today I took my mom to the doctor's office and I spent a fair bit of time in the waiting room just staring at it like a fish tank while listening to this project and writing down any details that stuck out to me as mentioned above. And I will say that in my tired state that actually Chris Carter did kind of hit the spot. Like, at the very worst, this album is at least pretty good background music. And that's not to say the lack of originality is that huge a problem. Like, my mind also went to a similarly derivative album that came much earlier, back when the artificial intelligence sound was still actually in its heyday, and coming from another member of a legendary industrial group at the end of their rope. Cabaret Voltaire's final album, The Conversation. This is just super straightforward ambient techno that's not that stylistically far removed from a project like this. And, I mean, this actually just missed the cut for my favorites of all time list. I know that Chris Carter's Chemistry Lessons doesn't really present any particularly out-of-the-box ideas, but it doesn't necessarily need to in order to be enjoyable. I mean, I've heard much more unique-sounding projects than this that I personally enjoyed much less. But I've also heard so many projects over the years that sound really similar to this one that I happen to enjoy more. Just being good background music isn't enough for me to fully sign off on it. I don't really find anything that special or interesting, and the fact that it so faithfully follows such a cliched sound and style that I've heard no shortage of other better projects in this exact same mold doesn't exactly help either. So yeah, this album is fine. It's fine. I get why people are into it, but I don't see it as anything essential. I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.